Hey guys, what's up? It's Charlie here, and today we're going to be looking at the 10 craziest things judges have ever done. Before we get into it, why not subscribe and press the notification bell too. Coming in at number 10, we have Alone in the Woods. In 2005 in Ohio, a woman was on trial for abandoning 35 kittens. Obviously that's a very sad thought, as these kittens did not fare well when they were abandoned. She was sentenced in the court by Judge Michael A. Cincinnati, but he gave her a very strange and creative punishment. He wanted her to understand what those 35 kittens felt like when they were abandoned in the middle of nowhere. Park rangers actually found the 35 abandoned kittens in 2 different words. So as part of this woman's punishment, Judge Michael A. Cincinnati made her spend 2 nights in the woods all alone. She had to spend 2 nights in the woods without water, food, or entertainment. Now, you may think this is very harsh, but this is literally like getting a taste of your own medicine. I think it was Gandhi who said, "An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind." But this judge clearly does not care about that. But things don't get much better for the woman named Michelle Murray. As well as spending 2 nights alone in the woods, she also had to make a $3,200 donation to the Humane Society. She also had to spend 15 days under house arrest and give $500 to the park rangers who found the kittens. I have to say, this judge was not messing about and must really love kittens. Next up is red tape. So judges get caught up in a lot of red tape. Red tape is of course slang for paperwork and files. But it seems one day a judge got so tired of red tape he decided to give some out to a convict. This one happened in 2018 in Ohio yet again. One day a man named Franklin Williams was on trial for various things. He was accused of robbery, credit card fraud, among other things. He was up against Judge John Russo. But Franklin made the big mistake, which was speaking over the judge. Franklin shouted out, "You're trying to take my life and you're not letting me tell you what's going on." Russo gave him a bunch of warnings to be fair. He said, "Mr. Williams, I am the judge in this matter. Shut your mouth and I will tell you when you can talk. Got it?" He then said, "Listen to me, if I have to, I will gag you. You will get a chance to talk." He then said, "Zip it and you will get a chance to talk later. I'm going to give you a chance to talk." But apparently Franklin just kept talking, so he decided to tape his mouth shut. I'm sure your teachers in school joked with you saying they're going to duct tape your mouth shut. But this judge really did it. He grabbed a bunch of red tape and taped this guy's mouth shut. Franklin said this was very humiliating, and the American Civil Liberties Union of Ohio criticized the judge's actions. But comment below whether you think this judge was justified or not. Next up is haircut. So here's another instance of an eye for an eye. One day, Caitlin Lopan and her friend were on trial for bullying a girl. That's right, these 2 teens were bullying a 3-year-old girl at a McDonald's. But I don't mean bullying by name calling, they actually cut off this 3-year-old girl's hair. The judge was so enraged with Caitlin, she told her she had to get a bad haircut. That's right there in the courtroom, she made Caitlin get a bad haircut as punishment. This is a very creative punishment, but did the judge go too far? Next up is savage judge. So judges are supposed to be very professional, but it's clear from this list sometimes judges can lose their cool. Well, that's exactly what happened in 2014 to Judge John McBain. One day a woman named Camilla Gamut was on trial for taking the life of her boyfriend. One of the family members was speaking about how sad it was that he'd passed away in court. But while the boyfriend's family member was giving a heart-wrenching speech, Camilla said, "Is that it?" She very rudely interrupted, and that's when the judge went crazy. The Michigan judge, John McBain, got very angry and was shouting at Camilla. He said, "Shut your mouth or I'm gonna put some duct tape on it." That's right, just like the judge from before, except he didn't actually do it. But what he did say made everyone's jaw drop, including Camilla's. He said, "I hope you die in prison." Judges are supposed to be fairly impartial and only rely on facts. But it looks like Judge John McBain really did lose his cool. Camilla was given a life sentence, so she may well pass away in jail. But it's pretty crazy a judge said this in court and stunned everyone. Next up is #sorry. So this one took place in France in 2012. One day a man named Fluzin Baptiste was complaining about his local politicians on Twitter. But he was complaining in a very rude way. He called one of them a son of a B and another a big S. That's right, I can't even say the words on YouTube. I'm sure it sounded a lot more fancy in French, but these politicians didn't really care about that at all. Instead of roasting them back on Twitter like some other politicians may do, I'm looking at you, Trump. No, instead what they did was suit him for defamation. The court actually agreed with the politicians who were roasted on Twitter, and they gave the man a pretty bad sentence. Not only did he have to pay 5,000 euros, he also had to send 466 apology tweets. The tweets all had to say, "I have severely insulted Jean-Francois Cope and Nathalie Moritz. I regret and I apologize." That's right, just like Bart Simpson repeating the same thing over and over again on a chalkboard, he had to do the same thing on Twitter. I'm sure he lost a lot of followers from this, as I can imagine that being very, very annoying. Next up is dog in school. So here's one which will really leave you scratching your head. And this is another one from Judge Michael Cincinnati, who made the woman spend a night in the woods all alone. One day a man named Robert M. Clark was up on trial. Much like the woman who'd abandoned kittens, this guy had actually taken the life of a dog. That's right, he took the life of many people's favorite animal. But instead of sending the guy to prison, he made him dress up like a dog and go into a school. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want a dog killer walking around my school. He had to dress up as Safety Pup and teach kids about safety. But don't you think it's creepy they sent a dog killer dressed as a dog into a young kid's school? Next up is See No Evil. So while it may be slightly naughty, there's nothing wrong with watching an adult video from time to time. But one thing that will land you in hot water is stealing from an adult video store. Well, one day a man named Jeremy Sherwood did exactly that. He stole a videotape from an adult store and walked out without paying. He was eventually caught up to, and his very embarrassing crime was in all the papers. Yeah, I bet he regretted not just paying the $20. Anyway, the judge gave him a very creative punishment. The judge clearly was not a fan of stealing or adult videos. So he made him stand outside on the roadside wearing a sign saying "See No Evil." And to top it all off, he also had to be blindfolded during this entire experience. I think next time Jeremy will just use the internet like the rest of us. Next up is Chicken Suit. So we've seen one man dress up in a dog suit, so I'm sure you know where this is heading. One day, 3 men in Painesville pleaded guilty to trying to solicit an undercover cop. This didn't work out well for them, and the judge gave them a very funny and creative punishment. Their punishment was to walk around their hometown dressed as chickens. They were dressed in chicken suits the entire time. Now, you may be wondering, what's the significance of a chicken suit? Well, they also had to hold signs saying "No Chicken Ranch in Painesville." You see, the chicken house is a place where what they tried to do is legal in Nevada. So it's clear the judge who dished out this sentence did not want the same thing happening in Ohio. Next up is long walk. So you may think walking is not much of a punishment. Well, unless you're really unhealthy, but most people don't mind a quick walk. Well, one day a woman named Victoria Bascom refused to pay her taxi driver. She tried to skip the fare, but she was caught out and went to court. Instead of giving her a fine or a prison sentence like normal, the judge actually gave her a very creative punishment. The judge said she had to walk the entire distance of her cab ride. The only thing was, her cab ride was 30 miles. That's right, Victoria had to walk for 30 miles without any breaks. This took her a whole 10 hours of constant walking and must have not been fun for her whatsoever. And on top of that, she also had to pay back the taxi driver for her fare. The 10 convicts who freaked out after getting a life sentence. Coming in at number 10, we have Mr. Jones. So this guy only goes by the name of Mr. Jones. He's up in front of a judge because he took someone's life. Now, the judge doesn't even know this guy, so she's trying to ask simple questions like, did he go to school? But instead of answering, the guy says terrible words to the judge and then makes strange noises. He makes a growling animal-like noise and shows off his teeth. I have to say, this guy looks very scary. And I don't think I've ever seen anyone as terrified as the policeman standing next to him. I am kind of scared for that police officer because that guy does not look stable. Mr. Jones is basically making weird noises and grinding his teeth. Maybe this guy's under high pressure because in the state this was filmed in, they do actually have the electric chair. Or maybe this guy's on something, seeing as he's doing a vampire face the entire time. He then starts making a weird groaning noise and saying he doesn't care about having an attorney. Guys, if you want to be a police officer, just make sure you're up for the task. I can't imagine being the cop standing next to this guy who's obviously losing his mind.
Do you want to be screened for an attorney?
I don't care.
Mr. Jones.
Next up is KAYLA Norton. So this is kind of a rare video because it's a female convict freaking out. In 2017 in Georgia, KAYLA Norton and her boyfriend were arrested. They'd been going around in a pickup truck and shouting obscene things at people. They were also waving around Confederate flags and saying very hateful things, to say the least. They also had some firearms and they waved them around at every single pedestrian they passed, including kids. Her and her boyfriend were arrested for causing a massive disturbance to her town. So you may be wondering, why is she freaking out and crying in court? Well, she actually got sentenced to 20 years. That's right, that's pretty much a life sentence. I have to say that does seem kind of harsh, seeing she didn't actually injure anyone. But what she did is definitely bad, and 20 years is going to be a lot of time to let her learn her lesson. One of the victims of her crimes was actually in court and she said, "I forgive you." But clearly the judge didn't, because this girl and her boyfriend got 20 years each.
But I want you all to know that that is not me. That is not me.
Next up is Jacob Morgan. So this guy did something kind of accidental which caused a terrible thing to occur. He was messing around with fire, trying to set fire to an apartment. He did set fire to his apartment and that ended up taking the life of his younger brother. Jacob Morgan said he didn't mean to take the life of his younger brother and he was kind of devastated by this. But the judge said his actions were absolutely terrible, and I do agree with that. At the end of Jacob's big high-profile trial, the judge says you're going to jail for life. That was when Jacob freaked out. He was stunned and crying and could not believe it. He starts crying and saying no and please don't send me to jail for life. Jacob then gets up and then he just falls down on the floor. He's probably freaked out seeing as he's going to prison for life, so I can see why he did fall over. But then again, that's why you don't start house fires.
Therefore, I am going to find that there is probable cause to charge the individual with the bound over for General Sessions Court for more charges.
Next up is John Freeman. So this guy took the life of a 5-year-old girl named Isabella Tennant. Now that's a terrible thing and he was very quickly arrested. At his trial, John Freeman figured out he would no longer be a free man. Unlike his name, this guy was going to be locked up for 22 years to life according to the judge. The guy looks like kind of a meathead and a tough guy, but he bursts into tears in court and says I'm so sorry to the family. It's hard to hear what he says in the tape, but he pretty much says I'm sorry I took the daughter away. He says I know nothing can bring her back and I'm sorry for that. But I'm pretty sure the judge and the parents cannot forgive this guy for what he did. He literally took a 5-year-old girl's life for no reason. After the sentence, he cried even more and shouted sorry at the family. But I don't think any amount of sorries will cause the family to forgive him or get him out of trouble. And rightly so, this guy should be locked away forever.
So sorry to all that family, but nothing can take away from that. I understand that.
Next up is KIRSTIN Wilkins. So this one is kind of ridiculous and funny. Make no mistake, this guy did freak out in court, but in a very unusual way. KIRSTIN Wilkins just got sentenced to 42 years in jail. Now this guy's already 50 years old, which pretty much means this is a life sentence. But that is when all of a sudden he seems to pass out in court. He says, "Your Honor, excuse me for a second," and then says, "I need some time." Right after that, he appears to fall over, knocking over his chair. All the people in the benches behind him stand up, but his lawyer just sits there. Maybe he said he was going to do this to his lawyer. And in case you guys haven't worked out what this guy's done, he's basically faked fainting. And despite all of the trouble, the judge did not even buy it. She simply called up and said, "Get up, KIRSTIN." KIRSTIN then just sits there in the chair pretending to be asleep. You may be thinking, why is no one freaking out in this major situation? Well, from the video it's not so clear this guy's faking, but in real life apparently it was really obvious. You could see it on his face and the judge even said he appears to be breathing totally normally. Just imagine fake fainting in court. That's pretty crazy. And believe it or not, famous record producer Suge Knight did the same thing a few years back.
Excuse me for a second. I need some time.
The fact that the defendant is slouching over to the side and acts like he's sleeping. His breath appears to be...
Next up is preaching to the judge. If you're religious, you may believe that only God can judge you. Well, that is true on a spiritual level, but of course judges still do have to judge you if you do a crime. Well, one inmate did not seem to get that, and he began shouting, "Only God can judge me," to the judge. Sadly, that's not a legal defense, and the judge did not care whatsoever. When you're about to be locked up, it's best not to preach to your own judge. Nothing wrong with spreading ideas, but it's likely not going to get you any less jail time. The judge stayed insanely calm, seeing as this guy was going crazy. Towards the end of the video, he turned very scary and began just screaming random stuff at the judge. Suffice to say, this guy was told to be quiet and he was locked up for quite some time.
Tell you, Judge, and that is that only Jesus Christ can judge me.
Yes,
all right?
sir.
You judge people as if your tongue is a gavel, and you prosecuted a lot of innocent people that let you do the same to me. You're sounding mistaken, my friend.
Just, yeah, leave him there, but just shut down.
Coming up next, we have Leon Montgomery. So, Leon Montgomery apparently took the life of a newborn baby. That's clearly one of the worst crimes you could ever imagine anyone doing. But according to the prosecution and the judge, Leon did do this and he got 40 years behind bars. Now, that is for sure justified considering what he did. But like what most would do in that situation, he freaked out. He said he was totally innocent, he didn't do it, and he needed a new trial. But this guy does not deserve a brand new trial. So after he was sentenced, he freaked out and began being very rude to the judge. And then because he was freaking out so much, the judge decided to give him an extra 6 months. So after this guy spends all of those decades behind bars, he has an extra 6 months to do. Now, maybe it was kind of harsh for the judge to give this guy 6 months just for talking back. But then again, what he did was so terrible, does it even matter? What do you guys think though? Comment below, was this judge going way too far with his punishment, or was she justified? If it was anyone else, I would say it's wrong, but seeing as this guy took the life of a newborn, maybe it's okay.
Doing her is wrong to people.
And that'll be 6 months to serve when you finish serving.
You know,
in this
6
case.
months, I got 30 years. Everybody here get.
Control yourself, I'm going to remove you from the court.
Coming up next is Mitchell BLAIR. So this is said to be the worst mother in America. Mitchell took the life of her 2 kids and stored them in her freezer. After she was arrested, she went to court many times and freaked out pretty much every single time. Mitchell actually couldn't pay her rent, so the repo men came to take her stuff. But when they took her freezer, they found the 2 bodies inside and they were stunned. BLAIR showed no remorse in court, instead she showed anger. And she actually said she would do it again if she could. Thankfully, she was given a life sentence as she is clearly a terrible person. She's being called the worst mom in America, but I think she's also the scariest. And instead of being angry at her own actions, Mitchell blamed the judge and her lawyer for her big sentence.
Everybody want to know? Yes, I did kill him.
And finally on this list, we have David MORAD. David was kind of a known bad boy and posed with lots of illegal things on his Instagram. One day, David MORAD broke into a home to try and steal stuff, but it went wrong and he almost took the homeowner's life. Now, thankfully the homeowner was okay, but David did try and take the guy's life. He was given a life sentence for this terrible thing and he freaked out in court. Instead of being the bad boy he portrayed on Instagram, he was a crybaby. And rightly so, I mean, he is getting a life sentence. But his punishment is 100% justified, seeing as he's done some really awful stuff. So now that David is behind bars, the world is hopefully going to be a safer place. But sadly, there's always more convicts and they're always freaking out in court. So if you want to see 10 more convicts freaking out in court, let me know in the comments and I will make a part 2.
The haze of the drugs has worn off as I matured and seen the lifestyle that I thought would
10 people found not guilty after serving life sentences. Coming in at number 10, we have Lawrence McKinney. Lawrence McKinney is now 60 years old and comes from Memphis, Tennessee. In 1978, he was wrongfully convicted of stealing a lady's TV. According to the prosecution, he also did unspeakable things to the lady. And for this, he was sentenced to 115 years in prison. 15 years for taking the TV and 100 years for the other things. So he was expected to spend his entire lifetime behind bars. But 31 years later in 2009, new DNA evidence came about. The stunning DNA evidence found Lawrence was not even on the scene. He was released in July of 2009 after 31 years behind bars. And as compensation after he was released, he was given only $75. That's right, they took away 31 years of his life for no reason and then gave him $75 to say sorry. At the time, he said he was happy he was released, but he says he has no life. His entire life was taken away. Now his lawyer is fighting for him to get $1 million compensation. But I think even $1 is not enough for 31 years in prison for no reason. And I can't believe they tried to give him $71 and then told him to just leave after taking away 31 years of his life. This is really one of the most terrible stories I've ever heard. And I hope Lawrence does get a lot more money in the future, but nothing can give him his life back. Next up is Craig Coley. This one took place in California around 40 years ago. In 1978, Craig Cody was accused of taking 2 lives. Those being his 24-year-old girlfriend, Wanda Witch, and also Simi Valley, her 4-year-old son. But in 2018, nearly 40 years later, Craig was acquitted. He was freed after it turned out the district attorney at the time cited false evidence. Now, unlike Lawrence McKinney of before, he was given a more decent compensation. He was given $140 for each day he was in prison. But that's still not very good, seeing as he said every day was a living nightmare. Also, he's now 70 years old and he went in when he was only 30. This means they've pretty much taken his entire life away, and he'll likely spend more of his life behind bars than free. In total, his compensation was around $2 million. But he spent a ridiculous 14,000 days behind bars. He says money nor anything can make up for that time lost. And it makes you think how many other people are behind bars for no good reason right now. Next up is Wilbert Jones. Wilbert Jones was sentenced to life in prison in Louisiana in 1971. He apparently kidnapped and did terrible things to a nurse. He was only 19 years old when he was arrested and given life in jail. And the crazy thing is, the only evidence against him was a police lineup. Wilbert was simply picked out of a police lineup by the nurse. But it turns out the nurse was incorrect and Wilbert had nothing to do with it. At the time, she actually told officers the person who did that to her was actually way taller and had a different voice. But the officers did not care and very controversially sent him to life in prison. The case was very controversial by his family, who says he definitely did not do this. And after they partnered up with the New Orleans Innocent Project, he was found not guilty. He hugged his lawyers and cried as he was finally released out of jail after 50 years. He's now 65 and is said to be very frail and aging. The nurse he apparently did this to actually passed away in 2008, and the nurse's late husband actually said that he agrees that Wilbert should have been released. Both the nurse and Tim did not agree Wilbert really did it, but it seems some corruption was taking place and the police wanted to put Wilbert away forever. Luckily he's out now, but he's already had his entire life taken away. Next up is KIRSTIN LOBATO. On the 8th of July 2001, a girl named KIRSTIN LOBATO, who was only 18, was sentenced to life behind bars. In a Las Vegas, Nevada court, she was sentenced to 100 years in prison. They'd claimed that she'd taken the life of an innocent person. That is because they'd found a man who was not alive. Days before this, KIRSTIN was jumped by a similar looking guy at a motel. She was able to defend herself with a knife and the man ran off. That's the last KIRSTIN saw of it, and she didn't report it to the police. However, she did tell her friends, and one of her friends reported this to the police. They then assumed that the person that she defended herself from was the person who was not alive. And also, because she was not sober at the time, they got her to wrongfully confess to what she did. This was the only evidence against her, and they didn't have any other key evidence. But after she spent 16 years in prison saying she didn't do it, she was finally found not guilty. It turned out that the guy who she defended herself from had come forward, and the person the police found who was not alive was a totally unrelated thing. KIRSTIN simply defended herself and had nothing to do with taking anyone's life. But sadly it was too late, she'd already spent 16 years in jail. The crazy thing is KIRSTIN had an alibi the entire time, but they didn't believe it. Luckily now she's out and is a free woman. And also because she was only 18 by the time she was sent to prison, she has a whole long life to live. She is nearly 40 now and they did take away a lot of years of her life. But she didn't have it as bad as some other people on this list. Nevertheless, imagine how scary it would be at 18 being sentenced to life in prison for something you never did. Next up is KWAME AJAMU. This one took place in Ohio, USA in 1975. When this man was only 29 years old, he was sentenced to life in prison. Apparently he'd taken the life of a salesman, but this was not the case. There was a witness statement saying he was there when it happened, but it turned out to be a lie. He was then convinced to testify as they said he's gonna go to jail forever anyway. He spent a crazy 27 years in prison for doing nothing. Under Ohio law, the wrongfully convicted earned $40,000 per year they were in jail. And seeing as he was behind bars for 27 years, that means he gets $1.1 million. But nothing can buy back that much time, and they really did ruin his life. He was seen bursting into tears when he was finally found not guilty of all charges. He said he was so happy this battle has come to an end, and he hugged his wife and the judge. I'm not sure how I'd feel if I was him, happy, sad, or angry. Probably a mix of all three. Next up is Ricky Jackson. When Ricky Jackson was just 18, he was sentenced to life in Ohio. He actually joined the Marines at 18, but had to leave as he had a bulky back. Soon after he returned home, Harold Franks had his life taken and they blamed Ricky Jackson. Apparently someone went into his money order store, stole $400, took his life and then fled. They didn't have any good evidence against Jackson. All they had was a statement from a local paperboy who was 12 years old who said he saw Jackson. The jury accepted this 12-year-old's account and Jackson was sentenced to life in jail. At first he was even sent to the electric chair, but luckily 2 years later the sentence was reduced to life. Finally in 2017 all charges against him were dropped. It was found there was no evidence and that he didn't do any crimes. It's absolutely terrible. They took 40 years of his life away for no good reason. He says he's finally free and is for once enjoying life. But he says it's scary just how easily people can take your entire life from you. And he actually met with the paperboy who put him behind bars and he says he forgives him. That is such a big thing to do and I can't imagine forgiving someone for doing that. But Jackson is clearly very strong-willed and I'm glad he's finally free. Next up is Mark Denny. When Mark Denny was only 17, he was sentenced to life in prison in Brooklyn, New York. Apparently in 1987 he'd robbed someone and done terrible things to them, but after spending 30 years behind bars he was finally let out. He asked many times for DNA testing but was rejected. But luckily the Innocence Project stepped in and they got a DNA test. They found he actually was not responsible for it whatsoever. His defense said Mr. Denny has been waiting for this day for a very long time. And to be honest, that's an understatement as he served 30 years for no reason. Next up is Richard Phillips. In 1971, someone took the life of a man named Gregory Harris. His brother-in-law said he saw Richard Phillips near the scene. They believed the brother-in-law and he was sentenced to life in jail. Richard Phillips didn't do anything and when he went into jail he was 27. Now he's 72 and he was only just let out. That's right, he spent 45 years in prison for something he didn't do. The only reason he was let out is because they found the real person who took Gregory's life. It's quite crazy it took them all this time to let this guy out of prison. And if they hadn't have caught the real person behind this, he may have been in prison for his entire life. I'm sure that's the case for many people, which is a really sad thought. Next up is John Bunn. When John was only 14, he was sentenced to life in prison in Brooklyn. Apparently he'd taken the life of an off-duty officer in Brooklyn. But he's now 41 and after 27 years his name was finally cleared. He began crying and hugged his lawyers and the judge in court. He says he's been battling his entire life to try and get out of jail. And he said to the prosecutors, "I don't deserve all the things you've done to me." And the crazy thing is that the prosecutors never even apologized. Bunn and his lawyers said it would be very nice to get an apology as he deserves one. And I think it's terrible that they sent him behind bars for 27 years and then didn't even say sorry. I hope he gets hefty compensation, but nothing can buy back all that time. Check out my second channel. There'll be a link to that on screen in a moment. But as always, thanks for watching. Check out some more videos on screen right now. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and if you haven't already, what are you waiting for? Subscribe to Top 10s.